For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
All right, looks like we are live tonight on Standing for Truth. We are here with Professor David Mcqueen a little bit later than usual. And for all those who love Professor McQueen's work that he's been doing here on this channel, he's been such a blessing. Once again, please go into the description box where you will find a playlist with all our previous presentations and lectures with Professor McQueen. So David,
so glad to be here tonight, and appreciate the Milky Way and stars that you showed in the introduction.
I appreciate it. Yeah, a little bit more relaxing of a pre-show than the typical piano one we do. So we're changing it up a little bit. Plus it fits with tonight's topic because we are going to be getting into a little bit of astronomy and distant starlight, because tonight's topic is debunking Hugh Ross and old Earth creation. So before I hand it over to David here, I want to point out to the audience, thanks for being here. We got a lot of good people in the chat. Tag me with your questions as always. We are going to have a question and answer section, so we'll try and get to as many questions as possible. George, as always, brother, thanks for being here as well.
No problem. True to my character, I've got a few jokes, but maybe I'll leave the time for David. I'll tell you some towards the end.
That's good. I look forward to your jokes each week, and so we'll look forward to that at the end. We want to start tonight by a discussion of a very prominent old Earth creationist named Hugh Ross. Now, Hugh Ross is someone that I met, and I've got the math here I've done on one of my sheets. I met him in the mid-'80s, and so it was 36 years ago that I met Hugh Ross at the Institute for Creation Research. Now, to give you a perspective, I will this year turn 69 years old. According to Wikipedia, Hugh Ross is around 75 years old. And so he's like my older brother. And like many older brothers, at a certain point in my life, he came to try to straighten me out and the other people at the Institute for Creation Research. Now, let's get used to some vocabulary here. a young Earth creationist is someone who believes that the Earth was formed 6,000 years ago. And we've talked about that before. But we want to go beyond that tonight to to young universe creationists. And you see, Hugh Ross is an old Earth creationist, but he goes about it. You see, I've got the arrows going both ways there. He goes about it from his background in astronomy. And so he's an old universe creationist, what I call ouch. So you've got yuck and ouch that we're going to talk about tonight. The old Earth creationist view, to me, is a compromise view for reasons that I hope I'll make clear as we go along. Again, I first met Hugh Ross face-to-face in the mid-1980s, about 36 years ago. And he came to the Institute for Creation Research one particular day where I was there with Dr. Dwayne Gish. We were the only two staff members that were there that particular day. Others were writing books and on speaking engagements and so forth. But we were there. And since my boyhood, I've had an interest in astronomy and wanted to be an astronaut or an astronomer or a person looking into lunar geology and so forth. And so my mom kept my astronaut hat from the 1950s. And so we're going to put the astronaut hat on, and we're going to try to go inside the mind of Hugh Ross. When Hugh Ross showed up in the mid-80s, he himself had just started his own old Earth creationism ministry. I met him, and he had a guy there was a Nobel laureate in astronomy with him that he was meeting with, and this is when ICR was in California. And so he came in actually without an appointment. And so Dr. Dwayne Gish invited me to come in and sit on the preliminary discussion. And so Dr. Ross and the other fellow said, I believe that Dr. Henry Morris is honestly wrong about such things as the HR diagram. Now, the pronunciation is Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. Many of you in Astronomy 101 have heard of this, and we're going to talk about that in some details. But Hugh Ross, at that point in my contact with him, said, well, Dr. Morris misunderstands that passage in 1 Corinthians, and he's all wrong about the HR diagram. The HR diagram has got to indicate that the universe is very old. So Dr. Gish and I sat there, and you have to understand that Dr. Gish was the vice president of ICR in those days. I was a brand new staff member, had been there since 1983. And so I deferred to him as the more senior scientist, and he talked with Hugh Ross about his own work, Evolution, the Fossil Says No, and his own biological concerns about organic evolution, and carried on the discussion. And he agreed to get back to Hugh Ross to set up a date. And I want you to understand just how gracious, probably more gracious than I would have been. This is the Henry Morris Study Bible that came out after his death. And Dr. Morris in this Bible has all kinds of commentaries about the particular verses. And Dr. Morris was a fellow who was very gracious. He accepted Hugh Ross as a Christian brother with a disagreement about the age of the earth, a disagreement about the chronologies and genealogies of Genesis 5, 10, 11, and so forth. So he came, and so we all went in there, graduate students also. There must have been 25 people in the room, and he had some friends of his that were astronomers that came, and Dr. Morse gave him the floor. And during the presentation, Hugh Ross went through the details of the HR diagram. If you just look it up on the internet, it's a bit ominous looking. Let me get this up close here. And George, tell me when I've got it at about the right angle so that you can read the different parts here.
Yes, we can see it. Yep.
Okay. So across the x-axis is the temperature of stars in degrees Kelvin. On the y-axis is the brightness. Let me move my hand here. The brightness of stars from magnitude 14 to minus 10. And at the top, you've got the range of temperatures, degrees Kelvin, from 30,000, and then as you move to the right, cooling off to 4,000 degrees Kelvin. To give you an idea of where things are, the line in the middle is called the main sequence. And you'll see the sun, our sun, resides on that main sequence part of the diagram. Supergiants are in the upper right. An example of a supergiant is in the constellation Orion. And you'll recall that one of the stars in Orion is sometimes pronounced Betelgeuse, Betelgeuse. There have even been movies made about this star. It's a supergiant star, a very bright star in the constellation Orion. And then there are very small stars that are called white dwarfs, very low magnitude. Now, let's make sure that we understand this diagram in more detail. And let's start with the numbers. Degrees Kelvin is ordinarily used in laboratory science to measure liquids that are very cold. But let's go up to the stars here, and we're going to see that 4,000 degrees Kelvin is 3,700 and change degrees centigrade. And then 30,000 degrees Kelvin is 29,700 and change degrees C. Now, can you see what we're driving at here, George, is you can almost substitute a centigrade for these numbers. You know, you've got 4,000 near the supergiants, and then heating up to 30,000 over on near the y-axis. Now, let's take this math and convert it to simply words that we can understand. So the HR diagram gets hotter to the left. You see it's cool on the right, hot on the left. You get cooler as you go away from the dwarfs, the white dwarfs. And notice as you go to the top of the diagram, stars get brighter. And so the way that astronomers talk about it is their magnitude becomes brighter. So if we're talking about a supergiant like Betelgeuse in Orion, it's a cool star, but it's very bright. And if you go down to the white dwarfs, they are very hot, but they're not that bright. Is that clear to you, Brother George? You see what I'm saying here?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yep.
Okay. Now, where does evolution come into this? This main sequence here, this middle part, is proposed by evolutionary astronomers, including Hugh Ross, to also mimic the evolution of stars. Stars with time going through a range of white dwarfs to our sun to supergiants. And then along the way, words like black holes and words like supernovae and so forth are used. Well, we want to defer those for another night and just stick to this vocabulary. So in this meeting over 30 years ago, Hugh Ross presented this diagram, and said, we as astronomers know clearly that there are very real, and if I move my head to one side, you see the arrow up from my ear on this side? George, that's the position of our solar system in the Milky Way galaxy. And we'll talk about those stars more in a moment. And so Hugh Ross argued with Dr. Henry Morris and said, no, you're simply wrong in your reading of Genesis, and you're certainly wrong in the HR diagram. So Dr. Morris, after an hour's discussion by Hugh Ross, simply turned to 1 Corinthians, which I'm going to do here. And I'm going to do a way of teaching, George, that I use when I teach the Bible to others, whether they're 10 years old or 60 years old. And that is to read from the King James as a standard reference. Then I'm going to read the same passage in a paraphrase that came out in the early 70s. So if you want to make notes here, we're at 1 Corinthians 15, beginning with verse 40. There are also celestial bodies and bodies terrestrial, but the glory of the celestial is one, and the glory of the terrestrial is another. And so this is vocabulary from 1611, but it's quite poetic. Let's read on. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars. For one star differeth from another star in glory. Okay, so that's King James. And now we'll turn to this paraphrase. This particular version is the Illustrated Bible, but it's still the paraphrase that came out in the early 70s. And here is the same passage in this paraphrase. The angels in heaven have bodies different from ours, and the beauty and their glory of their bodies is different from the beauty and glory of ours. The sun has one kind of glory, while the moon and stars have another kind. And the stars differ from each other in their beauty and their brightness. And so these two parameters, beauty and brightness in the paraphrase, is comparable to the vocabulary of temperature and brightness in the HR diagram. So Dr. Morris didn't have to pull out his Bible. He certainly had this passage memorized. And here is a summary of his comments to Hugh Ross back over 30 years ago. There is still another modern scientific confirmation of biblical revelation. One star differeth from another. All stars look alike to the naked eye, even through a telescope. They just seem to be points of light. Now, this, I would have written the sentence a bit different. George, I assume that as you go camping in Australia, you can look up at the night sky, and you really can see some stars that are more bright than others. Correct, George?
Oh, definitely. And you see a lot more of them too because of the fact you don't have the light pollution we get here in the city.
Yes, that's true. So let me read on. I would have written that a little bit different, but notice what he says here. However, analysis of their light spectra reveals that each of them is uniquely different from all others. Each one has its own distinctive. Now, notice Dr. Morris's engineering vocabulary here. Each one has its own distinctive ratio of apparent brightness to temperature. To each, so each is different in its glory from all others. So notice what he says here, distinctive ratio of apparent brightness to temperature. That's exactly what the HR diagram is without actually mentioning the name. You see the brightness is on the y-axis and temperature is on the x-axis. And so a supergiant area, like the area around Betelgeuse in Orion. Now remember that there are blue stars in the belt of Orion. Very interesting argument for a young universe in those. But let's go up to Betelgeuse, and if you look at Orion, it's the upper left, I think, when you look at it. So Hugh Ross was just shocked that day that Dr. Morris should have dismissed the stellar evolution argument with this type of vocabulary. To rub it in a bit as the years went on, I've always enjoyed quoting Genesis 1, where God created the lesser light to rule the night, the greater light to rule the day, and then in a dismissive way, almost like this, George, and oh, by the way, I created the stars also. And so I've enjoyed sticking the needle in to my old Earth creationist buddies that while the stars are part of our ability to determine seasons, and George, I was probably 40 years old before it went into my dense head that everything rises in the east and sets in the west. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. The moon rises in the east and sets in the west. Orion rises in the east and sets in the west. So if you go back and look at that beautiful introduction, you can see as you watch the sunrise and sunset that everything that's happening is going from the east to the west. I would imagine that would even be true in south of the equator, George, where I guess you can actually see the Southern Cross.
Yeah, we learned about the Southern Cross at I think it was even in primary school in my early years.
Yes. That is, George, the introduction that I wanted to give. I've noticed a couple of questions have come up in my private chat. Would you like to ask a question on your end, and then I could read this from Noble Eagle and Graham Gould?
Well, I was just going to add.
You can start, George.
I was going to just add a bit to what you said, David. Hugh Ross considers,
yes.
Well, we consider him as a progressive creationist, but he doesn't like to be labeled as such. But yeah. Ross professes to believe that Genesis is literal history, but his history seems vastly different from the literal text. Of course. One thing is he's accepting of the Bible and science being fairly similar, but then he doesn't agree with the fact that the sun was made in day 4, I believe. So I don't know. There's a contradiction there. I don't know how he can.
Oh, see, and this is one of the problems. This is one of the problems that Dr. Henry Morris and the rest of us that were his disciples over the years. This is what we come to. He said, "Okay, Hugh Ross, are you saying that each day is 1,000 years? Are you trying to take us back to 2 Peter 3? Hugh Ross, are you saying that each day was 1,000,000 years?" Well, whatever time frame you put on it, if you're trying to say that we can evolve the whole universe, let me move my head again so you can see. So are you saying, Hugh, that the Milky Way galaxy condensed from the Big Bang somehow, and then within the Milky Way, our star, illustrated by the arrow, whoops, lifted the wrong finger, over here on this side, you see the arrow, that's our solar system. So are you saying that the Earth, Moon system, the Jupiter, Saturn, all the rest coalesced around that? Well, if the Bible is supposed to be our guide, notice how upside down this is, George, and everybody else in our class tonight. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the earth was created first because man is the focus. This is the anthropology argument that drives so many evolutionists up the wall or up the tree of life, if you want to put it that way. And so it drives them nuts, the idea that we might be created special. But let's go beyond that. So you've got the earth being created first, and then the sun and moon in day 4, and oh, by the way, the stars. And so it's exactly the opposite of the old earth astronomers that are trying to say that everything we see in the Milky Way behind me here is coalescing from debris from the Big Bang, coming together and producing first the sun, then the earth, then the moon separates from the earth, like we talked about last week. And so the order is exactly opposite. Can you see the contradiction, George?
Yeah. I was just going to say the interpretation and adding words to the Bible is quite relevant here. He thinks, this is Hugh Ross, thinks the sun and stars were created before the earth, and get a load of this, and merely appeared to a hypothetical observer on earth on the 4th day. Now, if that's not adding to what the Bible says.
Yeah, it's a very real problem. And once again, one of the comments that Noble Eagle made a moment ago, Graham Gould made, he asked, is it right to call Henry Morris gracious regarding Ross when Jesus confronted error very powerfully? Well, Graham Gould's comment is well taken. Dr. Morris did graciously receive Hugh Ross, gave him an hour of all of our time, but at the end he said, your argument is unconvincing. Now, it's not exactly the same as Jesus going into the temple, seeing the money changers there, and depending on who you talk to theologically, engaged in the destruction of private property by turning over the tables, spilling their money, and so forth. I don't think anybody was hurt. I think it's a bit extreme to call it destruction of private property. But at any rate, the Lord Jesus got angry to see the temple of his Father defiled in this way. And so some would argue that Dr. Henry Morris treated Hugh Ross that day a bit more graciously than he should. But as the years went on, and if you check the very extensive writings of Hugh Ross, he very soon left astronomy and then began commenting about geology, which we're going to come to after a while. So that is that's a comment that we need to keep in mind. George, I see you're going to use a precursor here to what we're going to do. You say Ross has used arguments from fossilized or petrified forests, such as those found in Yellowstone, to argue for an old Earth. Again, he should have stuck his head in the stars and kept them there, because his geology is all wrong. I'll address that more in a moment. Noble Eagle asked a question about the idea of a local flood and who invented it and who thought about it. Well, I'll answer that particular question by saying that when I graduated from high school in 1970, one of the leaders of my local church, very proudly, I might add, gave me a copy of Haley's Bible Handbook. He knew I was going to Bible college for a couple of years, and he wanted me to have this as a reference. And in that book, the author very proudly points to a certain layer of sediment in the Tigris-Euphrates area. And he says in the book, oh, this is an example of Noah's flood. Now, I've come to realize that him saying that introduces the idea of a local flood because, as we have pointed out in the past, the correct way to view the Great Flood is that it was a global, aqueous, catastrophic event, so that any structure, a ziggurat in the Ur of Chaldees, a pyramid in Egypt, Machu Picchu in South America, the Chichen Itza Temple in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, none of those structures could have survived the catastrophic worldwide flood and would have been destroyed in what I called in the past phase 1 of the flood, which is the very intense erosion of the first 40 days and 40 nights. Does that help, George, you think?
Yeah, I think so, yep.
I've got a question here kind of pertaining to the topic before we get to, because Professor McQueen, you're right, we've got a lot of questions coming in that
No problem.
pertain to geology. So we'll save that for the next phase. This is a question not necessarily, this is a question that doesn't have to do with geology, flood geology, which we're going to get into it in a bit.
Yes.
Sheep Among Wolves asks, how does the first day in Genesis chapter 1 with the light and the darkness fit into young earth creation? Any thoughts on that, Professor McQueen?
Yes. And it's so handy always to go back and actually read what the Bible says. In a future presentation, George and Standing for Truth and I have talked about devoting a whole session to Charles Darwin and the origin of species, and actually reading what the man wrote. He actually wrote it beginning in the 1830s, but it was published in 1859. So it's handy to go back and actually read what the Bible says when you get past Genesis 1:1 and you go to the second verse in the Bible, which reads this way from the King James. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And I've got to turn a page here to get the next Bible verse. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and divided the light from the darkness. One very simple experiment that we always do with 10-year-olds when we teach them is we go to a flashlight like this and say, are we able to have light without the sun? Well, yeah, it's electromagnetic energy, and there is light without the sun. So there's no scientific contradiction to there being light. And since the sweep of the Bible from Genesis chapter 1 all the way through the last chapter of Revelation is the progressive revelation that the second person of the Godhead, the Lord Jesus, is the light of the world. And so it's appropriate that the light that day should pierce the darkness of what was created without form and void. Many Bible scholars, the Scofield Reference Bible, which I used early in my years as a young Christian, presents the idea that there's a gap in the whole part of Genesis 1:1, Genesis 1:2, and into that gap we put all of the dinosaurs, and so it's a tacit tip of the hat to evolution that many of these Bible scholars in the past did by saying, oh, well, God simply used evolution to create a Homo sapiens, and then he breathed the breath of life into Adam and Eve and made them a living being. Well, that is a forced and strained argument, which is exactly the critique that I give of Hugh Ross. His goal, it seems, is to be able to maintain his PhD in astronomy by viewing the universe as billions of years old and forgetting what in his mind is all the nonsense of a 6,000-year-old Earth.
I'd like to make a couple comments there. Great answer, Professor McQueen. I find it funny that people like Ross or Michael Heiser, John Walton, they like to say that young Earth creation is a new invention, which is actually furthest from the truth. We had Dr. Sarfati on, as you know, just a week or two ago, who demonstrated irrefutably that Bible scholars and church fathers all throughout history held to the young Earth creation view. And in fact, Professor McQueen, it is these new biblical compromising positions such as day age, gap theory, progressive creationism, evolution. These are the new ideas that have popped up essentially since the time of Darwin and Lyell as a way to force fit their interpretation into the Bible where it doesn't belong based on this pseudoscience. So I just wanted to point that out. Yeah,
and that's a good point. And just think about it, standing for truth, and George, that when Hugh Ross goes around to university campuses in Canada and America, as he's traveled the world, it's so cool to hold a light up like this and turn it on and say, oh, the light in Genesis 1, first day of creation, that light is the light of the Big Bang. And so you've got all of the matter in the universe that comes down to the size of a European soccer ball or a cricket ball or an American baseball, and then that explodes, and that is the light of Genesis chapter 1. Well, let's think about that. You've got this radial explosion from a central part of somewhere going out. Many young Earth creationist astronomers have pointed out that how can you ever get that radial velocity to slow down enough to begin a circular motion to cause all these galaxies and so forth to be formed? The physics doesn't work out. George, you're an engineer. How can you get massive radial velocity all of a sudden stopping and producing a spiral?
Well, in a vacuum, you've got the conservation of momentum, and really there is no way. I mean, there are examples. I think one of them is it's called the Goofy Galaxy. The Goofy Galaxy actually rotates in the opposite direction to all the other galaxies. So,
right.
How do you explain that? That's
right.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
And it's something. Now, I'm 10 minutes from my break that I usually take an hour into our time. And so let me stand now and pull the chart from the back and introduce this whole business of one of Hugh Ross's ongoing arguments is the idea, okay, let's say the universe is 6,000 years old. That means that we have 6,000 light years to deal with. But yet, what do we find? So let's turn to his argument. Let me stand up here without knocking my computer over.
David, before you do that, can I just say, in the case of Hugh Ross or old Earth creationists in general, in accepting the secular timescale for Earth's history, it seriously undermines the gospel by putting death, disease, and suffering in God's very good creation, as he said in Genesis 1:31, before Adam and Eve sinned and brought about the curse of death and the corruption of the whole creation. Now,
that's an excellent point.
This undermines the whole reason and meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection. This is no trivial matter.
No, not at all. And this is why Dr. Morris, all those years when he was teaching me, used what he called the eternal gospel. The Lord Jesus is the creator, he's the savior, and then he will be the coming king. And so to have him be the creator, you've got to have him as the one that's going to save us from sin. You can't use billions of years of death and suffering, even of protozoa, to evolve life and expect that to be an adequate explanation for sin and death and suffering. Okay, let me go on to this final point here before I take a break. Once again, you'll see in this area, this is the area of Earth in the spiral arms of the Milky Way galaxy. At the beginning of the presentation, there were some beautiful views of the Milky Way behind mountains. And if you look at the top of the diagram here, up in this area, this is a sideways view of the what's called the galactic plane for the Milky Way galaxy. And 1 degree of arc, well, actually 1 degree of celestial longitude and latitude equals about 500 light years. So let me go close here where I can see this better and look up close at what they say. So if you go to this side of the galaxy and you look at this part here, that's 150 degrees, 120 degrees, and so forth. So you do that math and you get to what Hugh Ross believes is a huge problem for creationists. You get 500 divided into 6,000, that's 12 units. And so there should be only 12 degrees in this diagram, but there are obviously more than 12 degrees. And from the Earth, you can use trigonometry, essentially right angles and 45 degrees angles and so forth. You can prove in kind of Astronomy 101 that there are objects, even in our own galaxy here, that are further than the 12 degrees that you do the math here, or more importantly, 6,000 light years. Now, this has been discussed many times, and not Ross, I've got Ross on my mind. Russ Humphreys has written a book about starlight. It's a book that has been promulgated by Answers in Genesis here in the States for well over a decade. It's not a simple book. I have called I've called Russ Humphreys to talk to him about the book. And our discussions don't get very far because he'll say, well, have you read this paper? Have you read that paper? And so I don't pretend to understand all of his argument, but he claims to have a model of a young universe that allows him to explain objects that are more than 6,000 light years away from Earth in a 6,000-year-old universe. Now, this starlight problem has been approached through my creationist career, going back over the last 40 years, in a number of ways. Some creation scientists have said, oh, I know the answer to this. We'll have the speed of light change as a function of time. And that will explain how we can get distant stars with the 6,000-year-old universe, what I call old universe creationism. Now, how have I taught it as simply as I know how, George? Let me give this to you, and then I want you to respond to it. Then I'll take my 1-hour break. This is the way that I have explained it over the years. Let me get a sheet of paper here and draw this out. Whoops, I dropped my helmet there. So here's the earth. And then God created distant stars. And what I'm going to do is use X's for these stars. And they're at great distance from the earth. They really are 10,000 light years. They really are 100,000 light years from Earth. I believe that during the creation, God created the photons of light that are coming from those distant stars toward the Earth, and he created them en route. Oh, some of my old Earth creationists, oh, they go nuts over this. They say, McQueen, what are you trying to say? That a certain star did not actually explode in a nova when it did? Oh, you mean the nova was programmed in along a bar 6,000 years old? Well, that makes God a deceiver. That makes God deceptive. Oh, he's saying that something happened that didn't happen. I said, no. That's not my argument. My argument is that God is what? Revealed throughout Christian Scripture. He's all-knowing, omniscient. He's all-powerful. He's omnipotent. But most importantly, he predestines, as it teaches in Ephesians 1 and 2, a great many things in our world. And so this starlight en route argument that I've used for years simply ties in to God's character in my book. You have an initial reaction to that, George?
Well, we had Dr. Jason Lyle about 5 weeks ago, and he's got a very good model on the time travel problem, and he actually uses Einstein's theories to show that it's all about the way I remember it is it's all a matter of reference.
Yes.
And he makes the point that no one has actually determined the one-way speed of light. There is no way that we can actually do that. So we don't know whether that instant when God created the stars,
yes,
the light was also instant as well. So I guess that's what I have to say to that.
And that's good. Now, with your permission, George, and Standing for Truth, may I take a 5-minute break and you drop my video, and I will be back and we'll pick up with questions and answers, okay? Both about astronomy and also about geology.
David, the way we say it in Australia, we say I'll take a 5-minute break and I'll be back in an hour.
And I can appreciate that, since you guys in Australia are always one day ahead of us in America. You can take your time. You can take 20 hours, 15 hours, and we'll just barely catch up with you. I'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you. No
worries.
Thank you. Let's get you out of the screen. Thank you, Professor McQueen. We'll see you in a bit.
Hey, Standing.
George, go ahead.
How many years does Captain Kirk have?
How many years does Captain Kirk have? I'm not too sure. You're going to have to tell me.
3. A left ear, a right ear, and a final frontier.
I like that. George, that might be one of your best ones yet. You're getting a promotion.
Oh,
That
I've got more.
that raise you've been asking about,
Yeah.
I'm thinking I'm gonna give it to you. That was good.
But the money's going one way. It's going from me to you. How does that happen?
Real quick, I want to, this has been great so far. I can't believe it's been an hour. Time's flying by. Thanks to the audience for a lot of good questions. Super chats, Noble Eagle, $20 super chat. Thank you so much. Thank you right here. JC Moto and the Moto Heads. SFT, totally missed the debate. Going to watch it all later. Share the link on my channel. Thanks again, guys. Here to support for the longer run. Thank you so much. You guys are the life and blood of this channel. Your amazing support and generosity is why we are able to get so many good shows, discussions, interviews, debates going on. So God bless you all. And we're going to be going into the next phase soon once Professor McQueen gets back, right, George? On probably with a more focus on geology. But I find it funny because I've seen, and give me your thoughts on this, George, because we've touched on this numerous times. Hugh Ross and Reasons to Believe, they are guilty oftentimes of what the evolutionary community is guilty of when they're attacking the young earth creation model, George. Because I've seen Ross, okay, and these old earth creationists attack young earth creation by saying that we believe in evolution in the sense of hyper-evolution, because we have to explain all the species coming about in just a few thousand years. They also say that's impossible based on what we know about genetics. But here they are, okay, a form of creation, a variant of creation, arguing against evolutionary creation, not understanding our model, George, where we explain the origin of genetic diversity and DNA differences as what? Created heterozygosity. We talk about it all the time. So therefore, those DNA differences are already built in according to the young earth creation model of speciation. That means you can get variation, incredible variation in just a single generation due to front-loaded genetic diversity. It's the evolutionists that have to explain the origin of all genetic diversity is what? The result of mutations over time, genetic mistakes over time. So they have to explain genetic diversity over time through mutations that destroy functionality. And then they can look to recombination, gene conversion to lead to new variety. No, we can look to recombination, gene conversion right away because the differences are already built in. George, I always talk about this. My wife and I, we could theoretically have 1 million children, and every single child would be different because we have built-in heterozygosity. So I just find it funny that the old earth creationists are using a straw man argument in the same way that the evolutionary community and the evolutionists are as well. Plus, we've done a number of studies on the number of species we have today, and they're perfectly in line with young earth creation and nowhere in line with deep time evolutionary history. I mean, we've looked at birds, we've looked at lizards, snakes, bats, rabbits, all perfectly in line with young earth creation numbers. So I know I just went on a diatribe there, but I was reading that argument from Hugh Ross, and Dr. Sarfati was addressing it in Refuting Compromise. So that just blew my mind, this whole claim and assertion that young earth creationists believe in hyperspeciation. It shows a misunderstanding of our model of front-loaded genetic diversity. What are your thoughts, George?
Well, correct. Like you say often, in a universe that's billions of years old, or sorry, an Earth that's billions of years old, why don't we see more speciation in varieties of birds, for example? We only see 10,000. I think it's about 10,000, something like that. But to stick to the topic, I find it a bit hypocritical because when they talk about hyperevolution, let's look at the stars, for example, right? Apparently, there's an estimated 10 to the 23rd power stars in the universe. That's 1 followed by 23 zeros, so that's quite a few. If you divide the number of minutes, for example, into that, that comes out to 14 million stars born every minute. So in the 5,000 year recorded history, why haven't we actually seen someone record the birth of a star? Surely that's a hypocritical argument. Oh, Star Trekkie.
Oh, yes, I heard your joke about
Professor
Captain
McQueen.
Kirk's ears. So I went into my office. I have quite a Star Trek collection. Why do I enjoy talking about the evolution of life? Why do I enjoy talking about Hugh Ross? Because it's science fiction, just like
Exactly.
Star Trek. It's no different. Okay, now,
David, before you start, what kind
yes.
of stars? What kind of stars wear sunglasses?
Oh, those must be really bright stars.
No, movie stars.
Oh, movie stars. Very good.
Is that why
Very
you're always
good.
wearing sunglasses there, George?
Oh well, no,
You're a
actually,
movie
I
star,
only
yeah.
want to drive the car. I only want to drive the car.
A year from now, we'll have to do a special compilation, George, of all your jokes and my jokes, and we'll have to put them together into a special session to entertain.
Yes, we'll do an entire session on jokes from young Earth creationists.
That's true. I noticed that there is a question here from Andrew that says, I've got to go soon, but can you ask what he thinks of light being possibly interpreted as a recombination after the Big Bang? I think the answer is no. There's no evidence in the Bible that there was a Big Bang. The Big Bang concept is a astronomical construct, a theoretical construct, if you will, that is used to explain away the sequence of events in Genesis chapter 1. So that's the way I would handle that.
Godzilla Freak says, remember, George, you just can't tell when stars form because it's such a gradual process. Well, no, because there would have been nothing there, and then something would have appeared slowly. So we don't see any of that at all.
Well, I notice that Andrew has asked me a second question here. He says, McQueen, the Big Bang was an expansion of space, not an explosion in space. Please fix your explanation. Well, Brother Andrew, I must admit I have to disagree with you there, because the only way I've ever heard it as a expansion of space is a fundamentally rapid expansion. And when you think of it on the scale of the whole universe, which is supposed to be, I guess, a radius of 13 billion light years, it comes down to some semantics. A rapid expansion is an explosion, as far as I know, in engineering, George. Is that true?
Exactly. I've heard that argument many times. I think they're embarrassed about the Big Bang being an explosion. I mean, even secular sources show it as an explosion.
Well, I noticed another question that has popped up here, standing for truth, is from Noble Eagle. He's referring back to a debate that Hugh Ross had with Hovent. And Hugh Ross argued that, well, there were times in the church that there were people that believed in a flat earth. Well, a very careful reading of passages in the Old Testament show that the Hebrew scholars themselves viewed the earth as spherical, not flat. My counter argument to that is there are some evolutionary astronomers that live in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California that at least have neighbors that have seen Bigfoot, and that they believe there might be a small population of hominid-like creatures holed up in the mountains of Oregon and Washington, and they wander out into the human population every once in a while. Now, you can see their logic there is not that bad, in the sense that you would only need about 40 individuals to have a reproducing group. And if anybody ever actually stumbled onto one of these hominid sort of things, they would be a millionaire. They could sell their photograph to the newspapers in Australia and all the newspapers in America that talk about aliens coming to America and so forth. So you can't characterize the Reformation theology of Luther and others, Zwingli and Calvin and all these guys around that time. You can't characterize their theology because there were some people in their circle that believed that the earth was flat. I'm sure that we could find some friends of Hugh Ross that happen to live on the West Coast that they themselves believe that there might be a creature called Bigfoot out. But are we going to dismiss everything that Hugh Ross says because of a couple of his buddies believe that there's Bigfoot? Of course not.
David, on that question about the expansion, I know they refer to it as inflation, but this is what you've got to take into account. They think that the inflation or the universe inflated 10 to the 26th power times its initial size in the first 10 to the minus 35 seconds. And then it mysteriously
explosion. If that's not an explosion, I don't know.
Yeah, and then the thing is, then Dave, it somehow mysteriously slowed down, and now it's just accelerating. But if you keep those figures in mind, and we know that the speed of light is 300 million meters per second.
Yes,
that means inflation occurred at around about 33 times 10 to the 51st power faster than the speed of light. Now, they mocked and ridiculed creationists when we suggested a faster than the speed of light to provide an explanation for the light travel problem.
Yeah.
And yet they themselves then postulate an inflation event that occurred, 10 to the 53 power faster than the speed of light. Totally hypocritical, really hypocrites.
Yeah.
Well, and essentially, I was just going to say one thing. Essentially, as you're pointing out, George, this is a rescue device on their part in order to explain away the horizon problem as to why the universe itself is so uniform, which it should not be if the Big Bang Theory is true, which means that they have their own light travel time problem. And yet they want to attack, apparently, the biblical model. So I wanted to point that out.
And yeah, good point. And George, your comment earlier about the problems with the gospel and the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, they're huge theological problems when you go about saying, well, we can have things our way as evolutionary astronomers, but you creationists can't have it your way. And the best way I like to describe this, George, is in a free society, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but no one is entitled to their own truth. And so standing for truth, as the years go on, has to more and more divide fiction from fact.
Yeah, Godzilla Freak. Sorry, mate, I took that seriously. So I didn't know you were joking. I apologize.
Okay, let's go to one of the things that we know Hugh Ross has chosen to talk about in regard to geology, I think he's come to realize that it's one thing to argue to let's say the population in the United States about an old universe. Why is it so easy to argue that? There are probably only 2,000 people in America that actually earn their living as astronomers. 1,000 of those are professors at universities that spend part-time at the large telescopes in America, or travel to South America or Hawaii or other places. And then there are probably 1,000 people in the 50 states that actually run telescopes in different areas. Okay, so there are only a couple of thousand people actually fully know what Hugh Ross is arguing. But if you expand that out to the people that are working in the petroleum industry, the people that are working in the coal industry, and all the different professions of geology that fall into this broad category that we've spoken of before called economic geology, copper, lead, zinc, gold, silver, you've got to bring your arguments down to earth. And I think Hugh Ross has recognized this. And so he has attempted to resurrect very old arguments. And let's use the coal measures of Tennessee and Kentucky as an example here. In Europe, in the days of Darwin and in the centuries before Darwin, there were large coal seams that in the European vocabulary was simply called the Carboniferous. And these coal measures allowed the birth of the Industrial Revolution. So very important in the history of the modern machine age to know about these European and British coal measures. Okay, everybody gets educated in England, and they start coming over to America in the period around 1800. And these geologists begin walking over the area from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean. And they very quickly discover that there's all kinds of beds of coal in what would be called the Mississippi River Valley. And then there are tremendous measures of coal from Pennsylvania to the northeast part of the United States. And so the vocabulary that American geologists began to use is, let's divide the Carboniferous into the Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, and Permian. And let's go through this again so you can remember the poem. Carry out some dinner, Miss Penny Pearl, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian on top of that, and Permian on top of that. And then you go into the Mesozoic. So when you actually spend time looking at these Mississippian and Pennsylvanian coal measures, you find some real problems with the idea that these were forests that grew and died and grew and died. And let me mention two of them. Dr. Steve Austin finished his PhD at what he prefers to call the Pennsylvania State University in 1979. I finished my master's degree at Michigan, which he prefers to call a Midwestern trade school. I'll doubt that. I'll use the word the University of Michigan. But all joking to one side, Austin's PhD at Penn State dealt with a particular seam of coal in Kentucky. And it revolved around two arguments that he explored, what's called the autochthonous origin of coal and the allochthonous origin of coal. So if you imagine this to be the continent, the old idea was autochthonous, where coal measures grew and grew and died, and you end up with these huge layers. What Austin found is that many of these Kentucky coal seams give evidence that they've been moved en masse a long distance, a lot, or allochthonous. So the allochthonous origin of coal argues against Hugh Ross's view. A second argument that comes from the middle part of the state I grew up in, Middle Tennessee, and I've seen these layers over the years, is the very fascinating idea that you've got, well, not idea, you have evidence that in these coal measures, there are trees, layer upon layer upon layer. And the old idea is that somehow these trees were sturdy enough to stand there for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years and let the swamp build up around them. It's a silly idea. These are called polystrate fossils, and these are another counter argument to Hugh Ross's view. What's another question that we can?
Well, David, we had Joseph Hubbard a couple of days ago, and he showed examples where brachiopods were found fossilized in a standing position, but yes, when you do the math in the area where he found them, the math showed that the actual deposition rate was 0.002 millimeters per year, which, considering the size of the brachiopod, I think it was 2 inches, that would have meant something like 28,000 years. The poor little fellow would have had to sit there for 28,000 years to be buried and fossilized. It's a ridiculous argument that they use about these deposition rates and the billions of years. It just doesn't work.
It doesn't. And I see that Standing for Truth has put up another argument from Hugh Ross, and this is the idea of a self-sustaining dynamo in order to explain away the decaying magnetic field that points to a young Earth creation. Is this a valid argument? And the answer is that Hugh Ross's argument is not valid for this reason. Let me get out another sheet of paper here, and we'll draw on our blackboard for the class the basic idea of the decay of the Earth's magnetic field. If you go back in history, and we'll put time on the y-axis there, and then the strength of the Earth's magnetic field on the x-axis. So the x is equal to the strength of the field. In the part of history that we can actually measure, going back to when the first measurements were made, the Earth's magnetic field is decaying. If you use the mathematical principle of what's called extrapolation, the time of the origin of the Earth's magnetic field comes out to be about 10,000 years ago. And then there is a time in the future where the field is going to decay to zero. And so this is a young Earth argument, wrong hand again. This is a young Earth argument that the decay of the Earth's magnetic field is an excellent argument for a young Earth. Okay, now we go from there to this whole idea of the dynamo, self-sustaining dynamo. Many of you that have had college physics, some of you that I'm seeing using my brain power to look out into the audience, some of you don't want to go back to high school and college physics, but I'm going to force you to do it with what's called the right-hand rule. Now, I realize on the TV screen here, it looks like the left-hand rule, but this is really my right hand. So if you have a conductor, and I'll use my pointer here as a conductor. If you have a conductor and electricity is flowing this way, you wrap your hand around it like that in the direction of that flow of electricity, and there will be a magnetic field perpendicular to it. George, you remember this from your electrical engineering in university, don't you?
Oh, definitely the right-hand rule. Yep.
And so if we imagine, and let me pull my globe over here. My dear wife was kind enough to buy me a new globe today as we were out and about. So if you put, let's get Australia on here to honor George. There it is, truly down under there. And if we imagine that there is and there's some evidence that the movement between the inner core, outer core, and mantle produces an electric field that runs equatorially, then we would predict that there would be a magnetic field that goes up to the poles. And sure enough, we have the North Pole and the South Pole. And were I to visit George in Australia, we could go out into the outback. We could actually, I've learned recently that there's a train, George, that runs in South Australia. Is it called the tea and sugar train? Is that what it's called? I forget what it's a train that runs in the outback. Anyway, I'm getting off the subject.
It's called the GAN. The GAN goes from Adelaide to Darwin. Goes straight up. Yeah.
Oh, it goes north-south. But at any rate,
yeah,
whatever direction it goes, George and I would be able to use a compass. Why? Because there's a magnetic field perpendicular to the equator. Now, over time, that magnetic field has rotated a bit, but we're going to dismiss that for this argument. Somehow, Hugh Ross and other astronomers, as they have looked at the geophysics of the Earth, have said, no. You young Earth creationists, no, you're saying that there's a decay of the Earth's magnetic field. Let me get back to my correct chart here. That is linear with time. I'm sorry. That is exponential with time. We can rebuild that. We can have a dynamic model to look at, and the Earth's magnetic field gets recharged and goes down, and recharged and goes down. Well, my counter argument to that, George, is the ICR scientist, University of Texas, El Paso professor, Dr. Tom Barnes, worked on this in the 70s and 80s, working on the actual data that we have going back several centuries. So let's go with the data we actually have rather than a theory that Hugh Ross and his buddy put together to support an idea of an Earth that regenerates its magnetic field.
Well, David, I think Standing mentioned earlier that they need their rescue devices, and the dynamo model is a rescue device because they know if they look at the empirical data that you mentioned and go back in time, the magnetic field would be so strong that it would literally melt everyone on Earth.
Exactly. And let's go for another one of Hugh Ross's arguments here about the fossilized or petrified forests, such as those found in Yellowstone National Park. And he uses that as a counter argument against the 1 year worldwide flood. So let me give two examples that shows that Ross is wrong on that point. First of all, he's wrong because he misunderstands geochemistry. He misunderstands this equation. And so let me write it out. Many of you know that the mineral quartz is composed of silicon and oxygen. And so it's Si plus O2 reacts to form silicon dioxide by this equation here. and silicon dioxide is quartz. And so by varying the parameters that we've talked about before in the time of the flood, and I hope you all have got these memorized now, class, tell me what they are. They start with temperature, then they go to pH, and then they go to EH, that has to do with the electrical activity. And then we commented last week about we have to add pressure. So if you take these geochemical parameters and have them vary in the correct way, you can then precipitate out a silicon oxygen rich kind of gel. That gel then gets forced through trees that have been knocked down in the early months of the flood. And as that gel moves through the tissue, through the xylem and the phloem, to bring back the vocabulary from high school biology about a tree, as it moves through that, it forms the petrified wood of the Grand Canyon. But let me bring up another example that you may not know. And we can state this like a game show question. Where is the only petrified forest east of the Mississippi River? George, if you know the answer, I'll send you by mail a set of steak knives. Do you know where it is in America? East of the Mississippi, west?
Haven't got a clue. Can I phone a friend?
It turns out it's in the state immediately to the east of Louisiana. As a matter of fact, it's only a 2-hour drive from where I live. It's called the Mississippi Petrified Forest. And here you've got some trees that were knocked down, well, actually buried, I guess I would say, late in the flood. And they are surrounded by a unique rock type. And the word for this rock type comes from Europe. The spelling of it is Loess. Get my pen working here. And there's endless debate with my professorial buddies. Is this Lurs? Is it Los? You know, how do you pronounce this? But at any rate, it's a wind-blown sand. And you may recall that in Genesis chapter 8, it talks about a great wind coming over the earth in the time of the flood, as the floodwaters were receding. And so if you visit from Canada, Standing for Truth, or from Australia, George, sometime in the future, I can take you over and show you this deposit. Once again, it seems like when you walk out to see it in the state of Mississippi, it almost, at first blush, looks like just ordinary trees that have fallen down. But they're not at all ordinary. They are petrified.
I'd love to come over, David, but I think Biden probably won't let me in because I'm a conservative. I'm a right extremist.
Well, the fact that so many of your buddies in the part of Australia that you live in are the descendants of criminals, well, maybe that would allow the gates to swing open.
Oh, that's maybe probably why, yeah.
I'd like to ask Professor McQueen this one. This one's kind of a basic one, and you have done a good job answering it in the past. But because I still see it over and over again, and Hugh Ross argument, he says that metamorphic rocks need millions of years to form as an attack on the global flood. That apparently the global flood would not be sufficient to form these rocks. What's the best way to respond to an assertion such as that?
Yes, well, fortunately, I took a class in my graduate days at Michigan under one of the premier metamorphic petrologists, Dr. Eric Cassine, and he taught me to read this type of diagram. Let me draw it out here. And this is a diagram of pressure and temperature. And I'm going to put a dot and an E at what is called the eutectic point. This is called a phase diagram. One has to take a very difficult course called physical chemistry. I had to suffer through this at Michigan. People made bumper stickers, George, that said, honk if you passed PChem. It was a very difficult course, but it taught you to read diagrams like this. Now, what's the significance of a diagram like this? Well, metamorphic rocks were perhaps created during the first week of creation, but for sure, metamorphic rocks were formed as mountains were built during the time of the flood. And that tectonic action, whether we're talking about rapid plate tectonics, catastrophic plate tectonics, at any rate, one way or the other, these reactions, the pressure and the temperature, created minerals, and I will put a KY on this side for kyanite, and on this side I will put a mineral like mica, MICA. And it turns out that in mountain building, as the pressure is put on and things are pressed together with these tremendous pressures, using the Appalachian Mountains as an example, you can plot on a diagram like this, called a phase diagram, you can plot where the mineral kyanite, which is a blue mineral, and mica will come out of solution and actually form these rocks. Now, what's so important about this thing called eutectic crystallization? Well, it is so rare that it's only really ordinarily talked about in laboratory experiments. But one of my fellow students at the University of Michigan, a guy named Dr. Don Alexander, did his work in the Western United States, and he actually found crystals that were at this eutectic point. Now, it's beyond the scope of tonight to go into all of what eutectic means. Basically, what it means is you've got a crystal which drops out of solution instantaneously. And to be able to catch that instantaneous formation of that particular kyanite or that particular mica, you need a catastrophic cooling of those metamorphic rocks. In other words, the fact that you can find eutectic minerals in nature is an argument for a recent catastrophic formation of metamorphic rocks. So that would be
something I didn't know. David,
yeah.
we've got a question here from Ogre343. He claims to be a geophysicist.
Good.
And he asks, what does low S have to do with the flood and petrified forests exactly?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question, George. Say it again.
What does the low S, that word that you spelled,
yeah,
have to do with the flood and the petrified forests?
Oh, okay. In Europe, the word lurs, as I've been taught to call it, is a reference to windblown sands that are often found in river valleys and other places. In the Mississippi River Valley that I live in, the Mississippi River itself, and I might as well draw this out to make it a bit more clear. The Mississippi River forms the boundary between the state of Louisiana, which is basically shaped like a boot. I live here. I'm going to put a V at Vicksburg. And then I'm going to draw the Mississippi River flowing down. I'll put a north arrow so you can see what I'm talking about. So here is the state of Louisiana, this boot-shaped state here. And X is where I live. The V is at Vicksburg, Mississippi. And then there's the north arrow. And then the Mississippi River flows down through our state capital called Baton Rouge and then exits into the Gulf of Mexico. Well, on the Louisiana side, let me get my other hand going here. On the Louisiana side of the Mississippi River, there are almost no Lurch deposits. There may be some, but in Vicksburg, where the famous Civil War battle occurred in the 1860s, the city of Vicksburg was laid siege to, and the Lurch deposits formed an interesting geologic feature, which turned into a very difficult military strategy feature, where if you look at the soldier walking in a stream valley there in the Vicksburg area, the Lurch is interconnected angular grains of sand that hold naturally a 90-degree cliff, a 90-degree erosion feature. And so it provided both the Union and the Confederate troops an amazing way to get around Vicksburg. You couldn't be seen. You could, George, can you see the tactical side of this? That if you're up there on top, you know, you can barely see these guys down below. Well, where's the geologic side of it? Well, this windblown sand in the area of the Mississippi Petrified Forest, you can pull this up on the internet. Mississippi is the state immediately to the east of us, and not far from Vicksburg, maybe an hour, there is what's called the Mississippi Petrified Forest. And these deposits I've been studying for several years and working on their reinterpretation in light of flood geology. And so far, what I've got is these logs being washed down from states north of Louisiana and Mississippi and coming down late in the time of the flood and being deposited near the V that you see on my map here. And the windblown sediments that are talked about in Genesis chapter 8. And since many students are not really familiar with Genesis 6, 7, and 8, let me go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 8 and the first couple of verses and show where this fits into my flood model that I've talked about in the past. The last verse of Genesis 7 says, "And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. And then in chapter 8 it says, every living thing and all the cattle that was with him on the ark, so there were 8 people on board the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the water assuaged." So that's a great 1611 word, but it means subsided. "The fountains of the deep were stopped, and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained." And see, so many Sunday school children sing these silly songs about Noah being on the arky, and there being 40 days and 40 days of rain. Well, the flood lasted a full year, 6 months of it rising, 6 months of it going down, as shown by that passage. And so the link between Lurch and the Mississippi River and the flood can be explained in my model that way.
Okay. There was another question. Old Earth creationists such as Ross say that because modern coral reefs are incredibly thick they must have taken millions of years to form. Is this a good argument against the global flood?
Okay, the counter argument to that deals again with conditions, and probably, George, you have seen, I assume that your time in Australia has taken you at least close to the Great Barrier Reef, which is on the eastern side of the continent, is it?
Yes, correct. I've been there once.
And if you go to the Great Barrier Reef, or you go to the reefs in the Bahamas and the Caribbean, you find a very interesting group of data. We have spoken over and over again about variations in the chemistry of the flood of Noah's Day. And I'll go write it down again. We got temperature, pH, we've got EH dealing with electrical issues, we've got pressure. Now let's add in some biological issues. Let's add in for the nutrients that are available. Let's add in the, I'll call it SUBS. So let's add some biological things here to the floodwaters. We've got the four we've talked about. What about the amount of nutrients? What about the amount of substrate? As the coral grows, it needs calcium carbonate. It needs silicon on occasion. And so the variation in these chemical parameters of the flood can teach us a couple of things. Enormous coral reefs that had been built in the time from creation to the flood. I'll use only one example. Remember that Methuselah lived 969 years and probably died the year of the flood. So we've got 1,000 years worth of growth of coral reefs before the first ones were buried in the first part of the flood. But what about the coral reefs that we see in our modern world, the coral reefs that we see in the upper part of the stratigraphic record? What would be called the Triassic, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, tertiary quaternary rocks that we see. If you have a tremendous amount of nutrients that are been moved around by the Great Flood, producing substrates just where they need to be, you can get phenomenal growth of coral. This has been done in the laboratory, and the evolutionary community is reluctant to take those laboratory studies and put them on the Great Barrier Reef or put them on the Bahamas. There's a tremendous motive because these areas are habitats for beautiful fish. There's a tremendous motive among many of my marine geology buddies and marine oceanographers to say, oh, human activity is destroying the coral reefs. Oh, human activity is making it bad. Well, if you look at some of the volcanic areas in the Ring of Fire of the Pacific, those volcanic eruptions, even through human history, have buried enormous amounts of coral. So don't tell me that 200 years worth of industrial activity could be what destroyed these reefs. But be very careful. Whatever you do, don't ride on a modern cruise ship and drive a Mercedes to the east coast of Australia to complain about the destruction of the reefs by industrial society. What's more consistent is to ride a dolphin or a horse if you want to complain about mines and metallurgy.
I'm gonna add to what you just said, David, because I'm not sure if you're aware, but there was a marine scientist was found to be unlawfully sacked by the James Cook University. This is in North Queensland for criticising his colleagues' research on the impacts of climate change on the Great Barrier Reef.
Oh, really?
But wait, I'll give you the gist of it. Okay.
Thank you.
Australia's Great Barrier Reef is, as everyone knows, is the world's largest. It stretches some 2,300 kilometres,
Right.
or 1,400 miles. Now, evolutionists claim it is very old, and most people think it is too old or too big to have grown in just a few thousand years, right? Actually, no. Even in the secular worldview, the Great Barrier Reef was exposed land as few as 10,000 years ago, at the height of the last ice age. So even they believe it grew in only a few thousand years. Most people are surprised to learn that even though the reef complex is very, very long, it is not very deep. In fact, the Great Barrier Reef has developed along the shallow water shelf, made mostly of flood-deposited limestone, and only began to grow as the sea level began to rise to today's levels, when the massive ice sheets began to melt at the end of the ice age. Now in the biblical world,
do I have my finger close to the Great Barrier Reef there?
Yes.
That's it. A little bit further up, but roughly there. That's it. Now, David, in the biblical worldview, the ice age was relatively brief and would have happened during the first few post-flood centuries. But since many of the reefs are now at sea level, they cannot grow any higher. How long would it have taken? Less than 4,500 years, perhaps.
Exactly.
This is ridiculous. See, they actually sacked this marine scientist for showing that empirical evidence.
Well, George, Standing for Truth, and you and me, we all know that if you are a nail that is only partially hammered into the floor, you're going to stick up. And if you stick up and try to say, oh, there may be evidence that global warming, oh, there may be evidence that evolution is not true, oh, there may be evidence for intelligent design, the authorities are going to hammer you down, aren't they, George?
Oh, yeah, well, Olga makes a point, says, well, George, 10,000 and 4,000 are very different amounts. Well, Olga, the 10,000, where do you think they pull that out?
Right.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
And also they're rejecting the global flood and still
exactly, yeah.
So here's the guy being hammered down for standing out. Yes, go ahead.
No, I was just going to point out that is such a great answer, Professor McQueen, because I've personally done some research into what people like Hugh Ross and Reasons to Believe in the Old Earth Creationists, what their best arguments are against the flood. And that's kind of what we've been asking tonight. And it just goes to show that you are calm, collected, and able to provide such a solid, fascinating answer to all of these arguments, which means the very best arguments that they think they have against a global flood are easily answered according to our model. So it makes me think that maybe they're not up to date on the young Earth creation research.
Oh, well, that's true. And let me make a comment on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hugh Ross is about 75 years old. I'm 69. So in 50 years, we will go to our reward. What we want to encourage the 20-year-olds and the 25-year-olds that are watching Standing for Truth is you need to use your university chemistry, your university physics, your university astronomy to pick up on these issues and do further research. Remember that the whole focus of what we're doing here is standing for truth, not for standing for theory or standing for hypothesis. If what we say is true, that there are really creation scientists, then there are scientific models that need to be studied in some detail. perfect example is the second day of creation. The creation of the firmament, the waters which were above the firmament, and the waters which were below. Creation scientists like Dr. Larry Vardaman have studied these for 50 years. Right. And at the end of the time, the models of what the atmosphere might have looked like above the Garden of Eden show that there was such an enormous temperature inversion, were there a water canopy around the earth, that Eve would not have had to turn the heat on to make the water in her golden pot boil. It would have boiled on its own. And so there's some real problems with the young earth model that need to be researched. But you see, why can't we be accepted in the universities in Australia, the universities worldwide, when we say, well, astronomers, let me move my head so you can see the Milky Way back there. Astronomers don't understand everything about these rings. They're always we'll figure that out. Give us more time to research. Why, George, can't creationists say the same thing?
Right. Very good.
Well, we know about the rings. They worked out a rescue device for that. It's called dark energy.
Yes.
This dark stuff seems to solve a lot of problems. But there was one question there from Olga that I saw. It says, question for McQueen: how does the flood? Okay, how does the flood account for? That's the one. Large amounts of non-pillow igneous deposits.
Okay, here's an interesting way to approach that. Well, let's look at the geology of Mount Ararat, and you can go to the works of Dr. Tim Clary at ICR and others that talk about the nature of the volcanic rocks around Mount Ararat. Mount Ararat, Lesser Ararat, all the mountains that run on that part of eastern Turkey are essentially volcanic mountains. Ark explorers that have gone up there, that are geologists, that have not walked up but actually climbed Mount Ararat, to 15,000, 16,000 feet, have reported pillow lavas in that stratigraphic sequence. And so the pillow lavas that are underneath, if you will, where the ark landed, clearly show that those basalts spilled out into the ocean. Well, what about areas where they don't? Let's go to the subcontinent of India and go over to, let's say, the western part of India. And there are basalts there that are called Deccan, Deccan, the Deccan Plateau. So there are thick units of volcanic rocks there that don't appear to have the pillow structures that they were deposited in water. Well, if we take that part of India where my two hands are, and imagine that early in the flood, enormous volcanic activity brought them into the subcontinent of India, and then look to the right and left of my shoulders out into Africa on one side and Indonesia and so forth on the other side, there could be pillow lavas that have been eroded to the east and west of these Deccan Plateau basalts. And so all we've got left is the middle, which doesn't appear to have been, what would the word be? The lava didn't flow into water. It formed thousands of meters of lava in a fault structure underneath the water. Because I'm coming down to my last 5 minutes of strength, that may not have been the best answer there.
No, that was fascinating. You know what? Since we're coming on the 2-hour mark, why don't we end it with this question? It's an easy question. I think it's a good question for people in the audience, anybody out there who comes across this video that might not be, expert flood geologists or geologists, but because it's a curious question. Let's just say, Professor Mcqueen, that you only had a few minutes with somebody for whatever reason, maybe waiting in line for something, or you're stuck in an elevator and you guys spark up a conversation. So let's say you only had a brief moment to discuss the flood. What would be the best way to approach that conversation? What would be the best way, real quick, to demonstrate why the flood, empirically and scientifically, best fits the evidence to somebody agnostic on the topic?
Okay, good. Let me put a couple of letters here. The letter A and the letter F. If I were on an elevator going up to the 20th floor, I would take out my pad and write these two letters down. And I would say, in my 50 years of studying geology, every fossil I've ever seen appears in the rock record abruptly and fully formed. A for abrupt and F for fully formed. Now, why would that be important? The fact that it appears abruptly is objective fossil evidence of a catastrophic worldwide flood. The fact that it's fully formed, that you don't find a half a trilobite and 3/4 of a trilobite, and then finally you get to the Cambrian of the Grand Canyon or Wales, and you finally find a fully formed trilobite. That is an argument against evolution. So the abruptness argues for a young stratigraphic column, and the fully formed is a clear argument that Darwin's idea that given 100 years or so, we could find all these transitions that he predicted is false.
Well, that's a great response, Professor Mcqueen. As always, we appreciate your time. And as always, such informative and detailed answers to these questions. They are such a huge help. I learned so much. I can speak probably for George as well. When I rewatch these, which I always do, especially when I'm not preoccupied when we're live gathering questions from the chat. And I just get so much from what you're saying and what you present us. So since we're coming to the 2-hour mark, why don't we hand it to Professor Mcqueen or George? Why don't we hand it for some final words, concluding thoughts, however you guys want to wrap it up.
Okay. I had heaps more, but I'll just finish it off with a couple of jokes. What do you do if you see an aggressive alien?
Oh, you alienate him?
No, you give it some space.
Oh, give it some space. Well, George, here's a question that my granddaughter posed to me. She was talking to me and she said, "Grandpa, how come my nose can't grow 12 inches?" And I said, "Well, silly, that would make it a foot."
Foot, yeah. You got to get some new jokes, David. I've got another one for you.
I've repeated that, haven't I?
Yeah. What's a light year?
A year that's been on a diet.
Very close. It's the same as a regular year, but with less calories.
Less calories. That's so funny.
Well done, David.
My friends, I'm going to leave the studio, and we will see you next week.
God bless you, David.
God bless you, David. Have a great show.
Thank you, friends. On Inauguration Day, I will hit the X button.
Okay.
Okay. Well, anyways, George, it's just you and me, brother. I can't match up to your jokes. That's your talent. That's your specialty. That's your skill. So I'm not even going to try.
I'm not even going to give you my secret of where I find them.
Jokes.com.
Yeah. Well, close. Yeah. I was actually going to bring a final, I guess, argument. It's not an argument. It's just a bit of evidence that Hugh Ross actually cited to me. I had a bit of a discussion with him on one of the social media platforms about the Oort cloud.
Yeah.
Now he cited a paper. The title of the paper was a new high perihelion transplutonian inner Oort cloud object, 2015 TG387. Now he was arguing that this Oort cloud exists, and this particular paper actually proved it. But when you read the paper itself, and I'll read just a part of it, it says, thus similar to the main group of clustered extreme trans-Neptunian objects, they call them ETNOs, may be shepherded into similar orbital angles by a, get a load of this, unknown massive distant planet called Planet X or Planet 9. Now, the interesting part about this, right, I actually posted to him a website that I read from NASA, okay? And this is what NASA has to say. It says, long period comets observed amongst the planet are thought to originate in the Oort cloud. No object has been observed in the distant Oort cloud itself, leaving it a theoretical concept for the time being. Now, shortly after I posted that to him, surprise, 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 those people that remember Gomer Pyle, who said that very often, surprise, surprise, surprise. I went back into the website at NASA, and guess what? They changed that article with a link to that paper. But wait, there's more. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Last night, when I thought I better check my facts, I went back to the NASA website. Surprise, surprise, surprise. It's been changed back to the original website article, which said leaving it a theoretical concept for the time being. These people standing have got a lot of clout. They can get people like NASA to change their website. just shows you what they can do.
Right. Yeah, no, it's it's pretty sad how desperate they are to hold on to this old Earth creation paradigm, because as you've demonstrated, the evidence from comets, that indicate a young universe, the rescue devices are laughable. We covered today with Professor McQueen the magnetic field of the Earth, and their rescue device to explain away that data and observable evidence is laughable, as Professor McQueen went into great detail on. And the same thing goes with all their other rescue devices when it comes to carbon in coal, fossilized wood, diamonds, or helium in zircon crystals, in genetics with mutation accumulation, mutation rates. I mean, all of these huge number of lines of evidence in all fields, right? Geology, biology, genetics, astronomy, you name it, all pointing to a limit on the age of the Earth and the age of the universe. Go ahead, George. I apologize.
Well, the most recent thing I saw on carbon was, I think they said the ratio of delta 13 to carbon 12. Now, just for those that aren't aware, the what's it called? The GIA in America. The acronym stands for I forget, but anyway, they have found that if you get a delta 13 concentration of -24, it shows that the material, be it a diamond or whatever, is of organic origin. So here they are, they're showing a ratio of delta C13 over carbon 12 that shows that's of organic origin, and they're saying the zircon crystal is 4.1 billion years old. Therefore, that's proof that biological life occurred 4.1 billion years ago. Well, two things there. How did they determine the age of that zircon? Secondly, they could never know the ratio because the C12, there's so much C12 in the earth in terms of coal, gas, oil, methane, that they could never know what that ratio is. But further to that, we know from the RAID team that they found helium in those zircon crystals,
Right.
and they've shown empirically they can't be more than 6,000 years old.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So as I keep saying, it's one of those shooting yourself in the foot questions.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of their questions are those, and a lot of their questions and arguments. Okay, because Dr. Sarfati really, really demolishes these arguments in Refuting Compromise. Okay, a lot of their arguments, which is funny, are presupposing or assuming that a global flood never occurred. Okay, because you can see Hugh Ross and these old Earth creationists, they have arguments such as, for example, here's one: sediment cover kilometers thick over metamorphic rocks took millions of years to erode. Okay, and then the answer by Sarfati: only at the erosion rates observed today, there is no problem at all eroding kilometers of sediment quickly with large volumes of fast-moving water during the flood. George, these arguments are assuming a global flood. So they're not even arguing against a global flood, essentially, because they're misrepresenting what a global flood would do. Just like it says here that you would have kilometers of sediment eroding quickly with large amounts of fast-moving water during the flood. That's exactly what we would expect. And Professor Mcqueen did a great job demolishing the arguments from metamorphic rocks, as well as granites, as well as chalk deposits, modern coral reefs. I mean, you name it, all their best arguments just dismantled one by one. Go ahead, George.
Well, Standing, anyone who has seen a catastrophic spillover like a dam can attest that erosion happens very quickly and catastrophically. I think it even cuts through basaltic rock. Under the right conditions. I mean, I've been in a factory where I've seen them use high pressure water to cut through steel. So you know, I mean, with the global flood is a catastrophic event.
Right.
You've got earthquakes, you've got volcanic eruptions, you've got so many multiple things. You've got liquefaction, all sorts of things happening that can explain a lot of the geological, strata that we see today.
Well, I want to point this out, but before we end it here, I know we're going on after 2 hours, but what you're saying is perfect, right? And it goes to show the type of straw man misrepresentation type of arguments that we get from the critics, okay? Because even today, and I know we oftentimes point this out, but it's such a good observable case, and the critics want to scoff at it, but they have no real response to it, okay? We have a small scale event, okay, pertaining to the eruption at Mount St. Helens, which literally, this is an observable event. This is small scale, though, I want to point out, compared to the catastrophic global flood. And what did this small scale event demonstrate, George? Well, it demonstrated that, for one, sedimentary layers, literally hundreds of feet thick,
form quickly,
laid down just in days, in hours to days, actually. Yeah. Not only that, demonstrated that canyons can be formed rapidly, okay, and how multiple fossilized forests, okay, and we talked about that today as one of Hugh Ross's main arguments against a global flood. We've seen how many fossilized forests could actually form as a result of one single volcanic eruption, okay? So I want to point out that all of these lines of evidence that we see when it comes to coal, oil, okay, with the flood, with the global flood and the catastrophic proportions of it, and it's the uniqueness of the global flood versus Mount St. Helens, which was just a single event, enough to demonstrate what I've just gone over. And now imagine the global flood. Imagine something worldwide, okay? All of these things, coal, oil, you name it, can be formed in months. You know, millions of years is not needed, is the point. Go ahead.
Standing, I've been doing this research now for over 11 years, and no matter what empirical evidence we bring up, they will always bring up a rescue device to counteract it. And some of it is ridiculous, like you know, the soft tissue on dinosaurs, for example. And I mean, I can go for hours, but I know we're into 2 hours and 7 minutes now, and I have to pack up and get ready to go to the lake for about a week's rest with some friends. So I've got to go and do some shopping.
Well, you've earned that vacation, Brother George. All those jokes you've given to us over the last few months, you've earned a vacation. Enjoy that rest and relaxation for the next week, George. We are going to miss you. But as you know, we got a lot more exciting events planned for the month of February, because January was packed, wasn't it, George? I mean, just in that first week, I think we had 3 or 4, maybe 5 big interviews. And so we've put out a lot of content, a lot of information, guys. And we're going to have the same thing for you in February. So, George, you've done a great job. You've worked hard. You've earned the vacation, brother.
Thank you. Look, I'll just finish off by telling you one last joke.
Yeah, go ahead.
What does a star win in a competition?
What does a star win in a competition?
Yeah.
You're going to have to tell me that one.
A constellation prize.
That's a good one, George. And that is a...
See ya.
All right, that's a good way to end it. Guys,
SFT is out.
And George is out.